Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Interlligent RF and Microwave Design Seminar after the enforced break of the last few years. So a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start is look at the question, why bother developing a custom MMIC? We'll then look at how we go about selecting the preferred process and the package. And a very important thing, how much will my custom MMIC cost? Is it commercially viable? We'll look at the MMIC design process itself and the layout process, and it'll be illustrated with clear, sharp images of real-world examples of things we've designed and developed. We'll look at MMIC fabrication and packaging. And then MMIC evaluation, both the prototype evaluation, the design proving, and then the pass-fail testing in production. Both very important, but really quite different in the way you approach them. And finally, we'll look at qualification. It's well worth doing. And the move to production. So, why bother developing a custom MMIC? So, MMIC, a microwave monolithic integrated circuit. They allow you to realize microwave, millimeter wave circuit functions in a cost-effective, compact, high-performance, highly reproducible form. Now, some of the MMICs you can buy today in small surface mount packages for a few dollars. 30 years ago, they would have been a hand-tuned, heavy box costing thousands of dollars. The technology, it's just moved on immeasurably over the past few decades. Today, MMICs are the key building blocks in virtually all microwave and millimeter wave front ends, point-to-point links, radar systems, satellite receivers, satellite payloads themselves in space. And we've designed custom MMICs for all of these applications. However, if you go onto the internet, you will find that there are many commercially available MMICs from reputable suppliers. So why bother going to the effort of developing your own? Not just effort, the cost, and the time required. Well, there are a number of reasons, and we at PRFI have developed MMICs for all of these reasons. So first to consider is implementing a specific functionality not addressed with the COTS products. And we've had this from people, normally people who are developing new innovative systems, and they want something quite specific. And sometimes, in honesty, we don't really understand why they want what they're requesting, but we work with them and we develop an IC, and then they're able to get this innovative functionality in a compact, cost-effective footprint. Replacing a component that has been made obsolete. We've done this a number of times. So you've designed a commercially available MMIC into your system. It's going great. You're selling your system. Then you get a call from the supplier. Last time buy. And so people think, right, how many of these do we need? And they make a last time buy. And then they start looking at their hopper full of MMICs, and it's dwindling, and they're still selling their system. And of course, they could redesign things and requalify the system, or in some cases, requalify a number of PCBs containing it. But that costs time and money. Another option, find somebody who can help you design a drop-in replacement. And that can save you a lot of effort. And we've done this a number of times now. Reducing component count or board size with higher levels of integration. This can be mopping up some discrete components or putting a couple of custom MMICs into a single package. Achieving critical performance metrics not available with a COT solution. Now, we sometimes get people come along, and what they've done is they've looked at every data sheet and they picked the best metric off each. It's like coming along and saying, yeah, I'd like this car. It does 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, 80 miles to the gallon, costs £3,000. No, you can't do this. These things aren't mutually exclusive. But we can work with people and help them to understand help us to understand what's really important to them and come up with a solution that is better suited to what they need. And this last one, producing a new part from a commercial product line. And this is when we develop ICs for people who sell ICs. And in this case, they decide what they want to develop. It's not up to us to judge how sensible that is. We just develop what they ask for, and then they launch that and sell it to the market. So whatever reason you have for wanting to develop an MIC, what you, of course, need to make sure is that the development costs, the non-recurring engineering costs, and the expected unit cost in production, they make commercial sense. There's no point doing this if you're going to lose money at the end of the day. So selecting the MMIC process and the foundry. Now, of course, you need a process with the required functionality that can give you the performance you need. This is vital. And it's important to undertake some preliminary simulations to allow you to assess this. So you might have a few candidate processes that you look at, undertake some preliminary simulations, work out which one is going to be best for you. But that's not the only thing that will lead to your decision about the process. The other things we need to consider include the production wafer cost. This will vary depending on the foundry and the process, and this will, to a large extent, determine the unit cost in production. The prototyping options and cost. Now, if you're a huge company, you might have a big development budget. If you're a startup, you might have less money that you're able to spend. And different foundries have different ways that they prototype the wafers. They result in different prototyping costs and a different number of parts you receive. So that's something else that we consider. The fabrication cycle time. This can vary enormously. This can vary between 8 weeks and 32 weeks, depending on the foundry and process. And yes, people's jaws do drop when you tell them 32 weeks. That's sort of towards the top end. Export requirements. Where are you based? What's your application? Where's the foundry based? I'm sure I don't need to go into too much detail. You can imagine exporting from one place to another, depending where those two places are, can be problematic. Model availability. So this, I'm talking about the circuit models you use to design your MMICs. Do they have models available? Are they accurate? And most foundries, in fairness, do have good models available, and they are largely accurate. But it pays to really understand where the limits of those models lie. So now let's look at the SMT packaging options. I'm focusing on the SMT packaging here. Obviously, we design a big GaN power device. We need to put that in some sort of flange package with a solid metal base. But for the high volume applications, we tend to use SMT. So I've written here an approximate frequency range. This is being pushed higher all the time, and it's not a hard limit. And depending what circuit function you're developing, depends how easy it is to reach or exceed this limit. So overmolded plastic, we've used up to about 40 gigahertz. And we often use custom lead frames at higher frequencies. And you'll be able to see one of these in one of the images I've got coming up. Air cavity plastic, that allows you to push a little higher the plastic solution. They look the same when you look at them, but there's additional tooling for the air cavity package. And as the name implies, you've not got any molding compound in direct contact with your IC or the bond wires. Laminate packages, these are often custom designed, and we successfully use these up to about 45 gigahertz. Again, I've got a nice photograph of an example of this coming up. Flip chip wafer scale packaging. So this really is a additional process step to the wafer processing. So the redistribution layer and the bumps for the package all come directly on top of the wafer, and you end up with a truly chip-sized package. But it is expensive to develop. It is difficult to get right, and you only really use this for very high volume applications. So some of the automotive 77 gigahertz radar ICs adopt this sort of package. Multi-chip modules, this is still used a lot, particularly in things like E-band transceivers. People use multi-chip modules. I know Filtronic have an E-band transceiver they're very successful with, and this uses bird die assembled into an innovative multi-chip assembly. And then antenna in package. And there are some fantastically impressive examples of this. I'm not sure how widely adopted they are in the real world. You do end up with a very compact solution, but it's very specific. You can't do anything with it, or you've got this IC and the antenna, and that's it. There is not much flexibility, but there are some impressive examples. This is a photograph of an IC in the 4mm by 4mm QFN package in which it was assembled. Now you can see the IC here, that's small, and that's mounted the other side of this. This is the solid base, it's normally a copper alloy on which this sits, and this gives you good electrical and thermal contact. And here we have the SMT pads, and the QFN is quad flat, no lead. In days gone by, we always used to have leads on packages, but eventually they worked out if they didn't have leads, they'd have less parasitics and they could push the frequency higher. So this is probably the most common example of a microwave SMT package that's used in volume production. So what sort of costs am I in for? Well, we have recurring costs, of course. Every time you use an IC, you have to pay these costs. And these costs are normally dominated by the die cost. A bit more on the next slide about this. In addition to the cost of the die, someone is going to need to be paid for the package and assembly. Production test costs, you need to make sure that any parts you're going to put into your assembly are fully functional. So we then have the question, do we package everything and test them and throw away the ones that don't work? Or do we package first, do we test first at the die level and then just package the working parts? And this all depends on your yield and your cost of your package. For low cost, high volume parts, you package everything. You don't test at die. Sometimes you might test DC at die level, but generally you package everything and then you just test at the packaged part level. Yield. This is quite an interesting question. And so you will, in an IC process, there will be a defect density and you will have some failed ICs just because of random defects within the wafer. But this is a low level. This is why we have these fantastically complicated and expensive to run clean rooms to ensure this is minimized. But you also need to consider, let's say I want an amplifier with 20 dB of gain. If I've designed my amplifier to have 21 dB of gain, then I'll get a spread in production. And if I'm then losing 20% of parts because I fall below that 20 dB level, then that's a mistake. So that will map into the yield as well. So yield is a complicated issue. You need to ensure that your yield is high and you need to take it into account when you're working out your cost. Logistics management and shipping costs. These will be required. You need to factor them in. Application support. If you sell ICs, this is mainly if you're selling ICs rather than if you're incorporating them into your own system. But you'll sell these ICs to people and they'll use them and they'll phone up and they'll say, that IC you sold me, it doesn't work. A lot of the time, this won't be true. A lot of the time, it's due to a user error. You get user errors with Bluetooth dongles. With a complicated IC that requires some intelligence to use, you can get a lot of user error. But you have to be nice to your customers and you have to support them. Marketing and sales costs. Well, if you're going to sell effectively, you need good quality, sensible marketing and sales. So how do we estimate the die cost? So it's dominated by the wafer cost. So you'll be charged a price per wafer. and it's critically dependent on die area. So you can take your wafer area and divide by your die area and get your die cost. Well, you can't. It's not that simple. We need to also consider, for example, that the wafer area, some of it's occupied by process control monitor sites. And the foundry used these during the manufacture to monitor how the process is going. And indeed, as they produce many wafers, they'll monitor these and they'll adhere to statistical process control to ensure that the process is tracking where it needs to. This is an array, a production mass set of a 28 gigahertz amplifier we designed. And these areas here, these are where the foundry insisted we leave space for the process control monitors. Now, it's a bit of a shame because that's an area we can't have amplifiers. And this is about 4% of the wafer is devoted to these process control monitors. And it'll vary a little bit depending on the size and shape of your IC. But that's an area lost in terms of the number of ICs you'll get. Also, on the wafer, you'll lose area to edge sites where you can't fabricate a full IC. You've just got a partial IC. So this is a wafer map supplied to us by a foundry. Now, the circle is the wafer size, the outer edge, and the inner edge, this is what they're recommending you consider as lost area due to edge sites. So you have to take that into account. So this is actually the production mass set for the production wafer for the 28 gigahertz amplifier I showed you. And you can just see, if you look carefully, and you can see here, these are the PCM sites you saw in the last slide. And yield again, I won't dwell on this again, but that will also, of course, affect your die cost. Now, you will have some non-recurring costs. Design costs, you have to pay people to design this. Prototype production costs. You won't fabricate 1 million ICs based on that. Well, not if you're at all sensible. You won't get the design done and say, right, let's make 1 million of these. You'll first of all make some prototypes, make sure they work. And those prototypes might be fine. And you might then say, yeah, that's great. Let's make 1 million now. The evaluation and design proving costs. Production mass set costs. Once you've got a design you're happy with, you need to make a production mass set. So you can make many of these highly reproducible and at a sensible low cost. The setup for production and pass-fail testing, device qualification, all of these need to be taken into account. So a brief summary of the design and layout process. Most foundries have a process design kit, and you get a palette of symbols here. Actually, you normally get several palettes, and you pull these off here. Now, this is for a 12-volt HBT process we recently designed something on. Here's a transistor. It's got it's got an emitter width of 2 microns in this case, emitter length of 20, and 2 emitter fingers. And that's what we call a unit cell. And we tend to build up these power HBT devices out of many unit cells with appropriate ballasting. This is a resistor, just a 50 by 50 resistor. That's the default that comes off the pallet. And this is a capacitor, 50 by 50 default on the pallet. Then, with the press of a button, you can transfer to the layout. Now, don't for a minute think you can design an IC, press a button, you've got the layout, send that off for mass manufacture. But there is a link between the components and the layout. This is the next stage of the design. This is all hierarchical. And this is a 3-stage power amplifier. We've got a power detector at the output, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. We've got a gain versus frequency compensation at the network, some disable logic here. And the first thing we do is the schematic design. And it's a long and it's a complicated process if you're going to get it right and produce a design that's going to behave sensibly with production, temperature, voltage. And so we do this and then we lay it out. And this is a layout. Here's one we prepared earlier. But I can't stress enough, you don't just do your schematic design, press a button and get this layout. And in fact, what we normally do, we do the schematic design, we do the layout, then there's a ton of work after that because we have to EM simulate it and optimize the layout so that the EM simulation works well. So we've got an RF input here, ground signal ground, RF output here, ground signal ground. We've got 3 stages of amplification. The output is 4 transistors. Microwave power amplifiers always have an array of transistors combined in a manifold. If you make a single transistor too big, it won't have any gain left. That's why we do this. There's 2 driving stages here and 2 small pre-driving stages here. Gain versus frequency compensation network. There's a little power detector here. It's a foreshortened coupler, and there's some control logic down here. What we do is we EM simulate the whole thing, and we don't EM simulate it all at once. So we've split this into 4 networks here. And the choice of the number of networks to EM simulate is a point for debate and discussion. But for this one, we did 4, and we got a very good agreement between measured and modeled. And these are just schematic symbols for each of the things that we EM simulated. If we dive into the output, this schematic symbol here, I think you can see these little blue dots. These are ports. And these arrows here are ports. So we EM simulate this output network. But again, we don't EM simulate the layout all at once. At millimeter wave frequencies, that wouldn't work. You might get away with it at lower RF. We pull in a component at a time into the EM simulation. We EM simulate this bit, we add this bit, we add this bit. And each time we pull a new thing in, we optimize the design to make sure the layout driven EM simulated performance is working, that it's right. And we do this just a component at a time. Then we move on to the network, next one, and then the next network. And in the end, we have the whole thing EM simulated. But it's a slow, time-consuming process. But if you do it right, you will end up with something that works. And here's a photograph of this same IC. And you can see it looks very similar to the layout. But, you know, if you think here, this is 28 gigahertz, that's a stub, that's a capacitor over via. Look how short that stub is. Hardly any length. There's not much scope for getting this stuff wrong. You really have to thoroughly EM simulate it and make sure you've paid a lot of attention to detail. To be an effective IC designer, you need someone who is methodical, has really solid attention to detail, as well as the technical microwave design knowledge. Here's a fabricated wafer. This is a 6-inch wafer here on a carrier plate. So we get them like this if we want to do on-wafer test. And you can see it's actually just held on with bits of tape. And this is, what happens next is we get it diced. And it's actually, these days, it tends to be laser scribed. And then it comes on expanded film. This is a wafer on expanded film. Here we've had all of the dye that we want to use picked off. And all you're left with here are some PCM cells and some little test circuits that we add on. So you see it's been quite neatly picked. So test. We can RF on wafer test. And that can be quite nice. And it's very useful for getting an early demonstration of the RF performance of your IC. And sometimes we'll do it in parallel. Sometimes we'll send them off for packaging and we'll take some and we'll do RF on wafer test whilst they're being packaged. Other times, if it's just people using the bird's eye or they want to make sure of the RF functionality before putting it in a package, we'll do an RF on wafer test. This is Graham in our clean room testing a millimeter wave amplifier. You see it on the screen here, and the measured performance here. And this is a zoom in of a mixer. You've got ground signal grounds here for an RF input, another ground signal ground here. This is a differential ground signal ground IF. I say IF, it goes up to 17 gigahertz. And then the DC monitoring and bias pins over here. So the evaluation PCB. Now there's no point spending loads of money designing an IC and having it manufactured if you then do a shoddy job with the PCB. To get the best out of the IC, you have to make sure you design the PCB sensibly and effectively. Now, this is something, we designed this PCB, and it's for an IC that we also designed. It's a 28 gigahertz IC. It's a commercially available part now. You can look up the part number here and you'll see that. And what you'll notice, a few things, you'll see under the IC in the die attach panel, we've got this array of tightly spaced vias. And we have those filled with solid copper. And we do that because that gives very good thermal performance. It also gives good electrical performance. You actually don't need to fill them with copper to get the electrical performance, but we fill them with copper, and that provides very good performance. You can see we even carry on out here. It's vital to minimize the grounding inductance with millimeter wave ICs, particularly millimeter wave amplifiers. You can see here we have a grounded coplanar waveguide input line, very closely spaced vias, close to the line here. And here at the edge, this is actually an edge-mounted coaxial connector. And this is an image, an X-ray image, and there's a couple of things I want to show you on here. The first is, you see these sort of grayish areas. This is voiding in the solder. Now, you need to work with your assembly facility when you're assembling these QFN ICs on an array of vias. Or you can end up with a horrible amount of voiding. You need this voiding to be less than 20%. So this is pretty good. We were all right with this. You can see here, 3 bond wires at the RF input, 3 at the RF output. This is minimizing the bond wire inductance. Of course, we modeled all this transition to make sure it was sensible. And you can see we've got a custom lead frame. So these ports here are connected to the die attached paddle area. And that gives you a little bit of thermal improvement, and it helps with the RF transition here. So we were getting a custom lead frame made. So any pads we weren't using, we connected to the ground layer here. We fused these pins. Now, this is a different IC. This is a 28 gigahertz front-end module. So this has got slightly smaller power amplifier here, TR switch, power coupler, and an LNA coming this way. And so we designed the PCB, we fit it with connectors, some decoupling components here for the supplies. And we also do a TRL calibration PCB, because we want to measure this IC. We don't want to measure these connectors. They're very nice connectors, but really what we want to know is, how does this behave? This is what we want to characterize. So this is a through, reflect, line calibration, and we calibrate up to the center of here, which is the same distance as to here, and we end up with measured data for just the IC sitting on a representative PCB, which is what you want to know. That is what the user needs to be interested in. And then, if he's sensible enough to adopt the same PCB pattern that you've asked him to adopt, and people don't always, I've seen people replace this array of vias with a single via. And you know what? It doesn't work so well. So adopt what you're advised from the IC supplier, and it should work well. This is an example of a custom laminate package. This was the package and assembly, the package fabrication, the assembly was undertaken by our friends at Filtronic. We only like to use award-winning assembly facilities. And what you can see here is this is a 26 gigahertz amplifier, and we put 2 of them in a package. Now here you can see we've bonded over this one. Now for other clients, for things I can't show you photographs of, we've actually moved to production and we've done a mirrored version. So you get short bonds on this edge as well. And this weird shaped structure here, this is actually ensuring a good RF transition from the PCB through to the IC. And if you were interested, there's a paper describing this, and indeed some of the other things on our website. You can download them and take a look. And here's the evaluation PCB for this. And you can see the 2 amplifier paths, one there and one there. So device qualification. So when you made your IC, it's best to qualify it. And what we're talking about here is a series of rigorous tests. How rigorous the tests are depends on the caution and bravery of the person who's going to be using this IC or selling this IC. But it's wise to do it, and it confirms that there are no reliability issues associated with the IC. Now, as I mentioned, the appropriate level of testing is determined by the manufacturer, but it can include a host of things. High temperature operating lifetime. So I think that's quite obvious. You take these devices to a high temperature and see how long they carry on working for. ESD, electrostatic discharge, human body model and charge device model are the two most commonly, but there are other standards. Moisture sensitivity level, this is associated with the package and shows how susceptible it is to moisture during the reflow soldering process. Temperature cycling, so you go up and down in temperature many, many times and just check nothing breaks. Unbiased autoclave, this is a measure of, as it says, resistance to moisture penetration. Thermal shock, so you're going to put these things through a soldering process, so shock them high, low, make sure they don't fail. HAST, highly accelerated stress testing. This is essentially putting your components into a pressure cooker. And the idea is that it brings on early failure mechanisms. In honesty, some devices don't cope well with this. It doesn't, you know, there are devices commercially available that wouldn't pass this test. It is a brutal test. And low temperature storage. So other items that you need to consider: pass-fail testing. All parts need to be tested to confirm functionality. You can do it in-house or use an external test house. So in volume, you use an auto handler, and it'll automatically load and unload devices from a socket. So they still can be used then, they're not soldered. You need to design a load board that includes this socket and any ancillary components. Now this is critical because that socket will affect the performance of the IC, and you need to correlate the performance of that IC when it's tested in the socket to how it's going to behave when you solder it down. And this will mean you adjust your pass-fail parameters accordingly. And this takes some effort to get right. Device characterization. So you need to understand how it's going to work over temperature and production spread, and put these on a data sheet if you're selling the part, and you'll see, you know, data sheets come in different levels of detail. Some people have very little, some have a wealth of information. And setting up the supply chain logistics. You need someone to be ordering wafers, making sure they're tested, so you end up with parts when you need them in the quantities you need them. And marketing and promotion of the product. If you're going to sell the IC, probably best to do this. So a few concluding remarks. So there are a wide range of MMICs available to commercial suppliers, and often your best bet is just to make use of these. However, there are a number of reasons, which I discussed earlier, why developing a custom MMIC might be appropriate for you. And it might provide commercial advantage, and it could certainly provide the best technical solution. So it can cost quite a reasonable amount of money to develop a custom MMIC. But if you then take this and you divide it across your production volumes, if you're making even, you know, 20,000 of these a year, and you take that over 3 years, you divide that development cost by 60,000, and it gets a lot smaller. No one wants to see the salary divided by 60,000, do they? So the MMIC design is only part of what it takes to have an MMIC product. People often say, you've got a design. That's not a product. You can't start selling that. There's a ton of stuff to do, a lot of effort to turn it into a product. If we've got time, I'm happy to answer any questions. But if anything crops up that you've forgotten about later, there's my email address. Feel free to drop me a line. Thanks.